Parents, understandably, often want to do their very best for their children. They want to look after them and give them the kinds of lives which they themselves, perhaps in their younger days, had never quite enjoyed. They want to care for them, to nurture for them, to do as much as possible for them. And such is the case of Myrsina's mother. When her husband was alive, the two of them had worked industriously to look after their children. Her husband had worked all hours to provide them money, to buy them nice dresses, to put food on the table, a roof over their head. And Myrsina's mother, she had cooked and she'd cleaned and she'd scrubbed and she'd fetched and she'd carried and she'd mended and she'd done everything. And when her poor husband died of an illness, she continued to do everything and earn a living, so that her three daughters should enjoy lives of goodness and luxury and happiness. At least that's how she saw it. And perhaps it comes as no great surprise that someone who spends their life cooking and cleaning and scrubbing and fetching and carrying and mending and sewing and holds down a job and looks after three daughters eventually succumbed to exhaustion and died. Now, Myrsina herself, the youngest of the three, was deeply grieved by the loss of her mother, but her two elder sisters were grieved all the more so, because they suddenly found that they went from lives of luxury and idleness and indolence to having to do all of the things that their mother and before her their father had done. Suddenly they had to learn how to cook and to clean and to scrub and to fetch and to sew and to mend, and how to earn a living and how to pay for the food on their table and the roof over their heads and everything else. And they realised what an enormous burden it was trying to do all of that for three mouths. Now, of course, their mother and father had managed it for 5 mouths, but these three sisters struggled to cope with the three of them. And so the elder two, and there was quite an age gap between the elder two and Myrsina, they got together and one day they plotted and they planned. It started merely as fulminating, as ranting and raving about how burdensome it was to have to provide for Myrsina, who was too young to do an awful lot of anything, it has to be said. And one of them, perhaps initially as a joke, said, wouldn't it be nice if Myrsina just wandered off into the woods one day and didn't come back? And as is so often the case with these things that start as jokes, it progressed and the discussion went round and round, and eventually they came to the conclusion that it would be a very nice thing if they could get rid of their annoying younger sister and only have their own 2 mouths to feed, their own 2 backs to clothe. And so one day they said to Myrsina, you know, my dear, it's such a very long time since we tended to Mother's grave. Such a very long time. That maybe the neighbours will think that we don't care for our poor dead mother. Really, we should go off into the woods where she's buried, for it was the custom of the people in that part of the world to bury their dead deep in the woods. We should go there and we should tend to it. We should put flowers on the grave. We should make sure the area is tidy and nice and no animals have done anything unsavoury in the area. And as it's such a lovely day, why don't we take a picnic with us and make a day of it? And Myrsina was as happy as the elder two to show her devotion to her late mother. And so she helped to pack up the picnic and prepare the food and the drink and helped carry the baskets as they went deeper and deeper and deeper into the wood. And they took a very circumlocuitous route to get to the grave, but there they eventually got. And they laid out the picnic and had a little drink and a little something to eat because it had been such a long walk. And then the elder sister said, well, we ought to get to start on looking after the grave, because look at it, there's weeds here, there's brambles there, the branches on the trees are all hanging down, it looks very unkempt. And they began to unpack, and one of the sisters said, oh, I bought these bulbs to plant around Mother's grave, there'll be such lovely flowers come the summer. And they set out all of the items they'd brought in the spring sun. And then the elder sister said, oh, silly me, I forgot to bring the trowels that we can plant these bulbs and these lovely flowers. And I forgot to bring the secateurs to trim the brambles, and I forgot to bring the lopping shears to take down all of these droopy branches. I've left them all at home. Well, that doesn't matter, said Myrsina. I can dig with my hands into the soil and we can plant the bulbs that way. No, said the sisters. We don't want you getting messy and grubby, and then we've got yet more work to do around the house, scrubbing and cleaning and repairing your damaged clothing. No, you wait here, and we'll go back to the house and we'll fetch all of the trowels and the spades and the lopping shears and the secateurs and everything else that we can do a proper job looking after the grave. And off they went. And Myrsina was left twiddling her thumbs and waiting. She set to making herself a chain of daisies to put round her neck. She waited some more, and then she made a little bracelet with seeds that she'd found lying around the place, and she waited some more, and then she started tidying up the moss and the fallen leaves and the mulch from around the grave. And yes, she did get her dress dirty, but she thought she had to do something. She couldn't sit there just twiddling her thumbs, because an hour went past, and then another hour, and then another hour, and then another, and it began to grow dark, and Myrsina began to realise that her two elder sisters were not coming back. And at first she was very worried. She felt that maybe they'd been attacked by bears or wolves or brigands or something in either the way home or on the way back. Some terrible fate must have befallen them. And she began to weep and she began to sob, and she tried to remember the way home, but it had been such a long circuitous route through the woods that she couldn't quite remember whether they'd gone left or right, east or north or south or west. And she sobbed so loudly that the trees with the drooping branches that grew around her mother's grave woke up. And they looked down on her and said, "Why do you weep, little child?" And Myrsina explained to the trees how she'd come to tend her mother's grave, and how her two sisters had gone home to fetch the gardening equipment and not come back. And now the moon was out and the stars were out, and she could see bats flitting about and hear strange creatures in the distance crying and howling and wailing in the night, and it was unnerving her. And the tree said, "If you wait for your sisters, you'll soon end up joining your mother in her grave, for your sisters do not intend to come back." We trees heard them talking as they journeyed through the woods, heard them laughing and sniggering at their plans to abandon you to the wolves and the bears. And we trees talk to one another, so we know it is true. Oh, and she sobbed more and she sobbed more, and at length the tree said, "Child, cease your sobbing and follow our advice. Take those bread rolls that you have there and roll them down the hill and follow where they go. Follow them and follow them and follow them." Well, this she did. She rolled the bread rolls down the hill, and they tumbled and they tumbled and they tumbled. They went this way, they went that, they bounced over the roots, down and down and down the hill they went, until at length they came to rest in a pit, a great pit, black as night, until the clouds parted from the moon and the light of the moon came down and illuminated the bottom of this pit, where there was a great house, a strange house, a house unlike anything Myrsina had ever seen in her life before. But there was lights coming on in the windows of this house, even as she watched, candle lights and firelights flickering in the house. And she scrambled down into the pit, forgetting the bread rolls, and she knocked on the door. And eventually a voice said, "Who is it?" And she explained that she was lost in the forest. Her sisters had gone off and abandoned her. She'd been here for hours upon hours upon hours, and she could hear wolves howling in the distance and bears growling, and she was afraid she was going to be eaten at any minute. And the door to this strange, strange house opened, and there was a most peculiar-looking man, and he beckoned her inside, and having no other choice, She went in. And there the peculiar-looking man introduced himself as March. And he introduced her to his brothers February and September and October and November, 12 of them in all, the 12 months of the year, each stranger than the last. And they listened to her story and consoled with her about how sad it was that her sisters had gone off, and how they'd abandoned her, and how they heard so often these days with all of the money worries that people had, that they were so often abandoning children and younger siblings and elderly grandparents just to try and make ends meet, and what a terrible state the world was in now. But they offered for her to stay and live with them in their house. For these 12 brothers said they had once, a long, long time ago, had a sister, and they missed her dearly, and it would be so nice to have a female presence in the house again. And so Myrsina stayed with them, and she helped around the house, remembering the various techniques she had seen her mother using for cooking and baking and clearing up. And the brothers, of course, were perfectly used to clearing and tidying their own place and cooking their own food. But it was nice to have somebody else around, and somebody to fuss about them, and somebody else to talk to aside from each other. And they got on remarkably well, the 12 brothers and Myrsina. Time passed. Could have been weeks, it could have been months, it could have been years, who can say? But time passed, and Myrsina grew and grew and grew. And there came the day when the 12 brothers had to go to town to carry out tasks. They wouldn't tell her what, but they had tasks that they had to carry out, things that they had to do. And they said to Myrsina, now you stay here and amuse yourself around the house. They've got a whole library of books you could go and read in. You could go and paint pictures in the sunroom. You could wander around the gardens, but don't go outside the pit. Just stay within the house, stay within the gardens that are within the pit. And Myrsina, of course, agreed to all of this. Why would she not? Now, unbeknownst to Myrsina and the 12 brothers, word had got round, for occasionally the 12 brothers, over the course of days and weeks and months and years, would have to go off on errands, 1 by 1 or 2 by 2 or 3 by 3, and they'd carry out tasks. And when they were out, perhaps at the market, perhaps visiting people, perhaps coming and going here and there, they'd often talk about Myrsina and how nice it was to have her companionship. And of course word spread round and round and round that the 12 strange brothers had a lady friend, a companion, a housekeeper, a sister, a cousin. All rumours went round and round and round as to exactly who this Myrsina was, and eventually rumours reached the 2 elder sisters, who were not best pleased to think that Myrsina had not been eaten by wolves or by bears or by wild boars or by abducted by bandits, but had been introduced to this life of luxury with these 12 strange brothers. And to them it seemed scandalous that their little sister should be shacked up with 12 strange men. I mean, who knew what went on there? Mind boggled. And so they decided that they would deal with her. And the 2 sisters debated and discussed exactly how to deal with Myrsina, and they came up with a solution. They went into their mother's old bedroom and they ferreted around in the mother's old jewellery box, and there they found a ring, a nice ring. And they took it and they soaked it for several hours in a dish filled with poison. And then with a pair of tweezers they picked the ring out and they put it in a box and they sealed the box down, and off they went. In disguise, these 2 wicked sisters, they went through the woods and followed the directions they'd been given by various neighbours and friends as to quite where these 12 strange men and their lady friend lived in the woods, and eventually they found the pit. And in their disguise as wandering Holy women, in their disguise as nuns, they came to the door of the 12 brothers' house, and they knocked on the door, and Myrsina opened it, and she did not recognise her sisters. It had been quite some time since they'd seen them, and they, at first, didn't quite recognise Myrsina, for she had grown and was in the early flushes of womanhood. And very nice she looked too, very well dressed, with jewellery and her hair done nice and everything perfect. She was happy and she was smiling and she was singing and friendly and welcoming these women in. And the three of them sat and they talked, and not only were they in disguise, but they put on silly voices in the hope that Myrsina would not recognise the voices or the faces. And eventually one of them said, as they got up to, "If you've been so kind to us, so friendly to us, you've looked after us, you've fed us, you've watered us, you've entertained us on our long pilgrimage," they'd told this nice young lady who had opened the door that they were nuns on a pilgrimage to a far distant place. "We would like to give you a gift." And she produced from inside her pouch the box, the ring box, and they opened it and they showed the ring to Myrsina, who said, "Oh, my mother used to have a ring just like that." "Oh, it is fate," said the two nuns. "We have given you something which is as a family heirloom to you, a happy memory of your joyous mother. Do try it on to see if it fits." And on she put the ring, and it fit. And she killed over dead upon the spot, for the poisons had seeped within her almost instantly. And the two sisters clapped and they laughed and they danced a jig and they took off their nuns' habits and they ran and ran and ran through the woods before the 12 brothers could return. And when the 12 brothers returned, they found Myrsina sparked out stone cold upon the floor. And they wept and they sobbed and they wailed, and their hearts were heavy with the grief of it, to the point where they thought they would never recover. And they couldn't work out how she'd died. There was no obvious wound or injury or signs of disease or of an accident or anything. She was just dead. Well, they did what they thought best for her. They created a chest, a great big wooden chest, really a coffin, but chest-shaped. And they decorated it with gold and with pearls and with rubies and with emeralds and all manner of precious stones. And they laid Myrsina in this coffin and they sealed the lid down. And they took this chest deep into the woods and they came to a glade near a river. And it was such a lovely spot, and they felt that this would be a good resting place. And they laid the chest down and they placed flowers on it. And each of the brothers in turn said something heartfelt over the coffin until they were done and the funeral was over and they returned to their existence by themselves in the house. And there that coffin sat in it. They have sat there for days or weeks or months or years. Who can say? Till one day there came riding past a prince. Of course, a handsome prince, as they always are, with his retinue. And they paused to allow the horses time to drink from the river and to give the saddle sore a chance to get off the horse and stretch their backs and their aching limbs and rub their numb nether regions. But that's another story. And whilst they were refreshing the horses and themselves, the prince noticed, covered in leaves and bracken and grasses that had grown up around it, something large and golden, and the occasional flash of red and flash of green and flash of blue. And he approached and he cleared the brambles away with his swords and he brushed away the grasses and the dead leaves that had fallen from the trees with the drooping branches around. And he saw this magnificent gold chest with rubies and emeralds and sapphires and diamonds and pearls and one thing and another set in it. And he was amazed, and his retinue were amazed. Like, well, what is it, and why is it sat here, overgrown with brambles and ivy and grasses and covered in dead leaves and bird poo and who knows what else? Whoever put it here has long since forgotten it. And so he had his servants take this golden chest and place it on the back of the wagon that contained all of their luggage, and off they rode to his kingdom. And finally they arrived there, and well, they placed this mysterious chest in a position of prominence, and people came from far and wide to see it. And the prince looked at it every day, and he fell. Well, if you can fall in love with an object, you could say he did. Maybe his artistic sensibilities were moved and stirred by it, but he was fascinated by it. He liked to sit and gaze and watch, and the precious stones were laid in strange, intricate patterns, and he often wondered what they meant, and he'd trace his fingers around the outline of these sigils and symbols and think about it and wonder what it contained. For he tried to open it once, and of course it was sealed, and he wasn't sure if he really should open it, not knowing what was in it. And such was his artistic sensibilities, so moved was he by this beautiful thing, that he stopped eating and stopped drinking. He became thinner and thinner and thinner, and iller and iller and iller. And all of the courtiers began to worry that he was coming to an end, and he was unmarried, he had no heirs, and there was the worry of who the kingdom would pass to if the prince died. They looked far and wide around. The king of this kingdom heard tell that his son was terribly ill, his son and only heir. And he came to visit, and he saw the state his son was in, and he saw this magnificent golden chest that his son would spend hours sitting next to, and the courtiers told the king that the son just sat staring at this chest and running his fingers over the patterns of rubies and emeralds and such like, and they'd started to wonder if this chest was enchanted, were it magical, was it a curse of some sort? For whilst it was a thing of beauty to behold, and people came from miles and miles and miles away to see it, look at the effect it had had on the prince. And the king nodded sagely and said, yes, I think there's something to this. Now, what is in the chest? He asked his son, what is in the chest? And the son said, I don't know, I've never opened it. It's always seemed such a thing of beauty. We did try to open it, but it's sealed shut, and if we were to jimmy the lid off, we would damage the chest, and I don't want to damage such a thing of perfection and beauty and intricacy. But the king, who was a rather loud and bullish man and used to getting his own way, said, no, none of this nonsense, none of this flim-flammery, you and your artistic sensibilities. And he sent for a couple of big lads from the kitchen to come up with jemmies, and they cranked off the lid, and yes, it splintered, and bits of ruby and bits of emerald pinged off here and pinged off there, and it spoilt the look of the thing, but they got the lid off. And inside was the body of Myrsina, as perfect as the day it had been laid. She was not some rotting corpse, some emaciated skeleton. She looked as if she were asleep. And indeed, they thought she must be asleep, for they tried to shake her awake, but she was as cold as stone, as stiff as a board. And if the prince were in love with the box, with his artistic sensibilities, he fell even more deeply in love with this beautiful woman. She was the most perfect looking woman he had ever seen, much nicer than any of the women in the court. And they looked her up and down, and I said, who could she be? Is there a sign of a name? Is there anything? And they looked for maybe an insignia on a necklace, or earrings or something like that, for often the well-to-do do wear insignia to give away their identities. And at length the prince said, I think there's something on that ring on her finger. Is it an inscription? It's difficult to tell. And the king looked at her hand and picked it up and said, I think you're right. There is some sort of an inscription on that ring. And he took it off and keeled over dead. But as he hit the ground, the ring rolled away from him, and he soon recovered. And they realised that the ring must have been cursed, poisoned in some way, for even as the king collapsed to the floor like a fallen oak tree, the woman in the coffin coughed and splattered and came to life as if she had been in a deep, deep sleep. And everyone stepped back amazed, and some of them thought she was a vampire who was about to leap out and attack them, and some thought she was a goddess, some thought she was a fairy, some thought she was a witch. Nobody quite knew what she was. But she stepped out, and they realised soon enough that she was perfectly human. And seeing the king sprawled on the floor seemingly dead, she was horrified, and although she'd never clapped eyes on the man before, she ran to help him. And as she shook him, that's when the king came back to life. And the king looked at her, and she looked at him, and he said, "You are truly a kind woman." And the courtiers agreed that whatever curse it was that had fallen upon the king, this woman must have broken it. She was not a monster, a vampire, a dreadful thing of the night. She was a blessing. And in the days that followed, the prince returned to full health. His appetite came back, his consumption of food and of wine and all manner of things returned to normal. He went back to looking healthy again, and the king, who was by now a very old man, said to his son, "That woman saved my life, and she has saved your life by emerging from the box. It is my wish that you take her for your wife." And the prince was more than happy to have her for his wife, and the two were married. And not long after the marriage, the poor old king passed from this world, but he passed happy in the knowledge that his son had found someone not simply beautiful, but kind and wise and caring and dedicated, and with 12 strange relatives who often came to visit and brought great wonders to the kingdom. And so, when the old king died, his son became the new king, and Myrsina became queen.